Welcome to the Longevity Week podcast, hosted by the Longevity Forum. We'll be featuring podcasts all week on the theme Sustainability in a Decade of Healthy Aging, which you can listen to online at thelongevityforum.com. On this episode, Andrew J. Scott, professor of economics at London Business School and co-founder of the Longevity Forum, will be interviewing Lucy Kelloway, the co-founder of Now Teach. I'll leave this to you, Andrew.
Well, it's a pleasure to be talking today to Lucy Kelloway. Lucy teaches economics and business studies at a school in Hackney, East London, and she's co-founder with Katie Walgrave of Now Teach, a charity aimed at bringing talented people with experience into the classroom. She's also an author of several books, including her most recent, Re-Educated: How I Changed My Job, My Home, My Husband, and My Hair. Thank you, Lucy, for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
I thought the book was great. It's brilliantly written. It moves at a pace, and there's the sort of the personal and the deep and profound, and even talks about how you teach elasticity of demand in a classroom, which is an economics professor I was most interested in. We're talking here about longevity, and so I'm going to focus on transitions. And the book is about your transition and how you did it and what you made of it. And you say early on in the book that many people, yourself included, arrived in their late 50s with no plans for the rest of their lives, and I wanted to write a book for them. Let's start with that point. Why now in particular is there so much interest in this transition? And is the book for everyone in the late 50s, or is it only for people in the late 50s? Why do you feel the need to tell your story, not just as a story, but for others as well?
Okay, so why do I feel the need to tell my story? Well, I don't know. Every story is really a sales pitch. This one is no exception to that. As you say, I'm the co-founder of Now Teach. What I'm really trying to do all the time is hunt out people of a certain age who are ready to chuck in their old careers and train again as a teacher. So I want to tell my story again and again for that. But there is this broader point, even for people who think that teaching sounds like a hideous thing to do with their lives. I still want to reach them because I think that they might be interested in my story, because this whole restlessness thing that so happens to so many of us in our late 50s, it's huge. I know that from writing my columns at the FT. As soon as I wrote anything about, confused and lost 50-somethings, the mailbag was absolutely massive. But also, the book is for people who are really happy with their lives, and they might like it as a spectator sport to watch people who are fed up with their lives and want to change them.
Hopefully we'll get a few people interested in Now Teach listening to this. But I want to focus on the motivation of the transition. You just touched on some of it. You paint in a very sort of understated but sort of punchy way this sort of combination of the passage of time that led to a restlessness, a sense of disconnection, boredom, tiredness, as well as sort of major life events, particularly the passing of your parents and the children leaving home. I wonder what you felt, which was the most important in driving you in this transition, or was it really the interplay?
I think it's the interplay. I think what happens is that, there's a sort of undertow. There's the fact that as we get older, lots of us, me included, what we want out of life changes. Our motivations change. So when I went into journalism, I thought it would be glamorous. I loved the idea of having my name, my byline in the paper. I thought would be a laugh. It was all of those things. Those things were massively important to me when I was in my 20s. By the time I was in my late 50s, and I've been doing it for over 30 years, I got no buzz out of seeing my name in the paper whatsoever. I didn't think I'd become remotely glamorous. I didn't care about any of that stuff anymore. And instead, I sort of thought, I need to do something more useful with my life, if that doesn't sound too priggish. I just thought I'd actually looked at my daughter who had become a teacher. She had joined Teach First. And I spoke to her. She was teaching in this really tough school in Leeds. And I spoke to her pretty much every night in her first term. And I suddenly thought, oh my God, my daughter has been more useful in the first term of her working life than I've been in 3.5 decades of mine. So there was all of that going on. But you refer to the sort of big life events. I think those were the triggers. Those were the sort of, to mix metaphors, the last straw. All of this was bubbling away anyway, but it took, first of all, my mum's death and then finally my dad's death for me to think, enough, I'm changing right now.
And there's what's lovely about the book is the way you bring in the different generations. You talk a lot about your parents and your children. And, it got me thinking, I never spoke to my parents how they felt when their parents passed. And I don't know if my parents would have been thinking about getting re-educated in their late 50s. I don't know about yours as well. So, do you think it is a generational thing? Do you think, or it's a more of a personal thing? Do you think your parents would have understood this?
That's so interesting, Andrew, because I suddenly realize I didn't really ask my parents how they felt when their parents died. Not really. I mean, I suppose they were younger. They kind of got on with it. But as for the reinvention of our parents' generation, one of the things that makes this different, I guess, is longevity. It's what we're talking about here. Also, they were much more in the era of jobs for life. So what happened in my dad's case, he was an academic and a librarian at the University of London. And he had done the same thing. And in his mid-50s, at pretty much the same point that I started wobbling badly, so did he. He thought he had something wrong with his brain, which he may or may not have had. He was never diagnosed. I think looking back on it now, he may have been very depressed. He took early retirement and that was it. He didn't do paid work ever again. And he lived till he was nearly 90. He was a very cultured man and he went to an art gallery every day and went to a concert pretty much every day. So he did keep himself mentally stimulated, but I still think that wasn't ideal. But my mum was sort of more interesting in that she became a school teacher when very, very typical. My brother had gone to primary school, so she sort of went back to work. And she did that until her mid-60s. And she did reinvent herself. She went the other way to me and became a writer about gardens. She wrote garden books and was the correspondent on the Oldie magazine. So I saw her reinventing herself too, to see my mum was professionally active until the day she died and she was 83. And that's a powerful example.
That certainly is. Now, that is really interesting. As you say, I hear about longevity and as careers lengthen, obviously we have to think about that reinvention more. So it's interesting you had that example in your family. I'm always struck that the average Brit has never been so old, but never had so many years left to live, which I think is kind of one of the dilemmas we face. But you then have this. You talk about these life cycle events and the passage of time, and then you have this sort of great Marie Kondo sentence where you say, "I'm just going to get rid of things that don't give me joy." And this orange kitchen countertop makes its appearance, which is sort of the lodestar of the book, isn't it? And your sort of rosebud, I suspect, in the film of the book. But you change an awful lot. Have you been a risk taker before? Is taking risks part of your character, or was this the biggest risk you've ever done when you changed all of these things?
Yeah, it was definitely the biggest risk. Was I a risk taker? Well, I think this was very strange. And I think when we talk about people being risk takers and non-risk takers, that is two blunt categorizations. So in some ways, I was massively risk averse. Once my children were born, I wanted a job with no travel. I wanted to be very stable so that I could focus on them. I'd never taken financial risks. Everything was about stability. Yet you could say that professionally, I took risks in how I approached my career at the FT. I sort of started columns that hadn't been done on the paper before. I very much opened myself up to, real ridicule and failure. So I think you could say there was some sort of risk taking within the context of that very stable life and career. But yeah, I suddenly thought that buying that house was the first major life decision I had taken. Isn't that incredible? I was then, I think about 56 when I bought the house. I hadn't really taken a big decision to get married because I was pregnant anyway. So what the hell? That's not to say that I wasn't with the person who I wanted to be, but there wasn't an, ooh, shall I, shan't I moment. Joining the FT was a no-brainer. I was just glad that they'd have me. So there hadn't been those let's roll the dice decisions. I just kept on going. And then the orange worktop, I can't say it walked into my life because worktops don't really walk, but you get the drift. I walked into the worktop's life and I just thought, I need to live in this house. And it was a risk in that it did involve, David and I were sort of separated anyway, but it involved making that formal by selling our family house that we'd been living in separately, and sort of breaking up the edifice. It felt that I was breaking up the edifice and the institution of the family, and that was really terrifying. Financially, it was insane because I took my half share of the house, then put in all the savings that I had. So I was sort of, really leveraging myself up, which made no sense at a time when other people are sort of cutting down in terms of where they live. It was also miles away from anywhere. Islington is fairly on the map. This was deepest Hackney, which was not even on a tube line. So from whatever way you looked at it, it was a pretty peculiar thing to do. But I think it was the best decision I'd ever made.
Well, from the cover of the book, it is a glorious orange, I have to say. It's just, I can see the motivation. But I'm thinking, was the risk part of the appeal?
Was it? Maybe, because risks make you feel very sort of tingly and alive. They make you feel the opposite of stuck. No, I don't, but I don't think that was all of it. I think it was just a recognition that I was badly stuck in a lot of ways. And what the orange was it showed me that there was a way out, that I could break through it all. I could walk away, I could leave. And this was so modern. I'd lived in the sort of classic London Victorian houses all my life. And this seemed something so different. And I thought, I can make the numbers work. I can do this. And that was just an incredible feeling.
And of course, you made a number of changes, but now Teach, you're not asking people to change all four of those things. You're just asking them to change their job. So how big a risk is that for people, do you think? And what type of personality finds it appealing?
Well, it would be so lovely if I could give you a really clear answer to that. But the truth is, there are lots and lots of different answers. And how big a risk it is depends on where the person is at that point. When I left the FT, I think there was no jeopardy at all because I had it. I was absolutely finished. I really did not want to write another column as long as I lived. So what was the very worst that could happen? Well, I could maybe go into teaching and find that wasn't for me, but would that be a complete disaster? No, I had a pension and, so on. Interestingly, I first considered this 10 years earlier when my mum had died. I was then a really young thing of only my late 40s. Then the risk seemed too big to me because I was walking away from more. Taking a big cut in income was going to be a bigger deal. I was still much more sort of tied up in the status of what I was doing. So the risk would have been much, much bigger then. And I think that's one of the joys of being a bit older is that the stakes for us are lower. So we can take to what might seem like to outsiders like huge risks. Only we know they're not really very big risks at all. We're not putting ourselves on the line in the same way because we've already proved ourselves at something else. So this is all extra. We're into extra time, maybe than what we thought we had when we were much, much younger. When I said that we don't plan for this point in our lives, I thought by I'm to be so old by my late 50s, I would have kind of stopped working. So it wasn't a part of my career that I ever thought about. So all the deep satisfaction I get from it seems to be a bonus. But so anyway, you talked about risk, and so that would be my answer on risk for me. But there are other people who go into it. They're younger. They're in a much less stable financial position than I was. They're taking a real financial risk on it. And also, it's simply, it's difficult being a teacher. So it's a risk every time you walk into a classroom in a way. But that is an agreeable sort of risk of the tingly, what I sort of think of as the tingly sort. It makes you think life is full and interesting and there are lots of challenges.
Yeah, and I like the point you make, and I think that came out in the book, is almost the biggest risk was not making the change, and that sort of comes through well. And you say that you felt you did consider it in your late 40s, but now think you'd have been too young for the change there, which I thought was very interesting. But then you also give some other motivations for doing the transition, and as you say, this is a challenge that many people face. So you say you want to do something more useful, and that is a seemingly quite a common motivation. The desire to learn something new, which again is a common one. Then I thought there were some interesting ones. You felt you were no longer getting better at what you're doing, which I thought was an admirable one. But then you said, I want to start at the bottom again. Do you want to elaborate on that? Because I thought that was really interesting, and that ties into some of your earlier comments about status. Why did you want to start at the bottom again?
It's sort of amazing being at the bottom when you don't really have to prove yourself again. The bottom is a very scary place to be when you're in your 20s. But if you have lived your life somewhat towards the top in whatever profession you've been doing previously, with that comes quite a lot of responsibility. It's quite a lot of bullshit, actually, that goes with it. You get rather further away from the actual thing itself. I thought, wouldn't it be lovely to be sort of someone who no one is looking at? You're just a trainee along with everyone else, and you're trying to learn how to do something that's difficult, and that's all there is to it. So the starting at the bottom, I absolutely loved, but only up to a point. There are difficulties with it because I'm holding forth to you, Andrew, because the truth is, if you spent your life as an FT columnist, you're quite used to being listened to. As a teacher, of course, you're listened to every day by your students, but are you listened to by the senior managers in school? Well, hell no, you're not. Of course you're not. You're only a trainee. And I found that hard, not at the beginning, because I knew I had to be blotting paper, just soak up everything. But probably by the second or third year, I started thinking, hang on a minute, I really don't agree with this. I think we could do this differently and better. Why are we doing this? My old pastor's a non-executive director to ask why are we doing this? Explain it to me. And actually schools are very hierarchical places, and probably you're not going to be listened to when you come up with those views, which may or may not be right, possibly inexperienced and not right at all, but that's quite hard.
So having this other outlet of now teacher must be invaluable there. But the other thing I wanted to sort of make a note on, we'll come to it later, perhaps became more, is in all the motivations for the change. I think at the end you briefly say something along the lines, and with the children leaving and your parents passing, you were no longer a carer. And I thought that was really interesting because one of the themes of the book is how much of this is a change and how much of it is continuity. And I thought, was that getting into a caring profession that was part of the way you saw yourself, as well as how you saw yourself making a contribution?
Oh, gosh. No, that wasn't what I meant. No, and I don't think teaching is a caring profession. I mean, God knows we care enough, but that isn't my understanding of care, although there can be elements of it sometimes if you're in safeguarding roles. That wasn't what I meant. What I meant is that if you are a carer, you're absolutely tied down. And, you can't pick your own time. You need, if there is somebody who you are caring for, you can't just not be there. And so that it was, when my dad was sort of slightly losing his grip on the world towards the end, and he would ring up and not know where he was. And I can't say, well, sorry, Dad, I'm going to a party this evening, or I'm going on a training course, or actually I'm away for the weekend. That wasn't going to work out at all. So, it was a very big responsibility. And when Dad died and my children were at university, I was free in a way that I've never been in my working life. And of course, there's grief that goes with that, but my God, it's a new opportunity too.
Okay, interesting. And I want to talk now a little bit more about the actual transition itself. And no doubt you feel it's a continual process. But in the book, you sort of say you sat in the family home and you howled at doing something irretrievable, is the word you use. And, just as the title of the book says, you changed your job, your home, your husband, and your hair. Did you sort of think that you were going to do all of them, or do they kind of just go like dominoes?
You see, this is so interesting because before I started thinking about this and writing the book, I would have said there was no link between these things at all.
Interesting.
The career thing was for some of the reasons that we talk about, changing motivations and all of that. Equally, and this is something that you've written about as well, Andrew, that, maybe for some people, if we are living longer, it's too much time for one relationship. That my marriage too, for different reasons, after having really been quite successful, after 25 years, really had come to an end. And I would have said that those two were completely unrelated. But I think the link between them is that once you have made one change itself stops being frightening. So I think that is where the link is. And even, of course, in the book, when I say how I changed and my hair's kind of a joke in a way, because who could care less? But I seriously do think that if I hadn't have changed all of the other things, I probably would still be slapping the brown dye on my hair too.
Interesting. Okay, so it does become easier. And, the other thing I was mindful of in reading the book, I remember talking about the 100-year life to a student who came up to me and said, so what you're really saying, there's no such thing as a midlife crisis anymore because you've got enough time to reinvent yourself and sort things out. And I was also interested in Mark Friedman, who runs Encore, who I know you know, who says we don't face a midlife crisis. We have a midlife chasm because there aren't the social institutions to support reinvention. And yours is not a midlife crisis. You don't call it that, but you did go through an unusual change. And I wondered how you felt in terms of the social institutions and norms and supports. I mean, you sort of seem to just sort of blast through it. You give the sort of report of various people who were slightly askance or astonished at what you did. How did you feel? Did you feel you were, out on a limb, or did you feel that this was sort of a very normal thing and found loads of people going through the same process?
No, I didn't think it was normal at all. And that was partly why I set up Now Teach, because, what I saw, both through my friends and acquaintances and through FT readers, was, as we've already talked about, there was there's this restlessness. There is the chasm. Nobody is saying, look, here is your milk round for people in their late 50s. Here are the different things you can do. Here is how you start retraining. These things are just beginning now, but we are really at the start of that. So no, actually doing it was really unusual. So the fact that I, as one random journalist, could create a national news story about the fact that I was becoming a teacher in my late 50s shows how unusual it is. And thank God, thanks to Now Teach, it's a lot less unusual, but it's still, you still have to explain yourself quite thoroughly to your friends and family for something that a lot of them do think is completely mad. A lot think it's mad, but a lot don't. So, I think that the social support or lack of it is very polarized. I think that there are a lot of people who would love to do something similar, but can't bring themselves to for a whole number of reasons. And they are massively sort of admiring and supportive. Then there are people who just don't get it at all. But that's fine. again, just going back to this point about how much easier it is when you're older, you don't need everybody to love you and agree with you in the same way. So if a few people think you're nuts, fine.
And, were there points when you wanted to just turn it all back and just say, oh my God, I shouldn't be doing this. I want to go back to before?
No, absolutely never. There are a few aspects of my old life that I miss. One of them is my colleagues, because I love chatting, and I love chatting to people who are clever and funny and look at the world in interesting ways. And my FT columnist friends were absolutely brilliant. And to have them on tap every day was just wonderful. And, a harassed staff room of teachers, even if they could match that, they're too busy to talk anyway. So I really miss that. I sometimes miss the autonomy of my old life. So sometimes people sort of say, when's good for lunch, or can we have a coffee? And I think, are you joking? Do you know what teaching is? You can't, you're at school, you can't meet people for lunches or coffees. Or people sort of say, would you like to do this? Or can you come and talk to people on a Wednesday at 11 o'clock? You think, no, I can't. I'm a teacher. So I do sometimes miss that autonomy, but that is about it. Do I miss the whole life? No. Do I miss the status? Definitely not. Do I miss the business of having to come up with ideas every week for columns? No. And so I haven't once overall.
And, obviously in starting at the bottom and doing something new, how do you deal with being bad? I'm not saying, everyone's bad when they begin, and sometimes that's bad because you don't know it and you've got to learn it. Other things, you actually try and learn it and just realize you're just bad at things. So how do you cope with that?
Yeah, I mean, it requires an awful lot of clenching of the buttocks. It really, really does. So before I started, everybody who I met in teaching said to me the same thing, which is, this will be the hardest thing you've ever done. And every single time I heard that, I kind of nodded politely, saying, yes, I know it's going to be very difficult, and that's the point of doing it, and blah, blah. But inside, I was thinking, yeah, difficult for most people, but I'm going to actually be really good at this, because my mum was a brilliant teacher. My daughter's a brilliant teacher. I like talking to people. What can go wrong? And actually, I found it was the hardest thing I've ever done, and still do. And I was terrible at the beginning. I was really shockingly bad. And it was very difficult. And was it bruising to the ego? Yes, I guess it was. I mean, if you are used to being good at something, and then you discover that, you've forgotten to take the books that you need to class, you've brought the wrong worksheets, you've forgotten 3 students' names. I was then teaching maths. The ultimate nightmare was I'd get so flustered, I'd get my own sums wrong on the board. Then I was terrible with the technology. So could I get the right presentation up? Could I control the slides? I was always touching the smart board, and then the slides would go mad. I mean, it was an absolute horror show. But you just have to have faith. And I think the thing that helped me have faith was that right from the beginning, I hoped what I was after was this sort of magic that I thought I would find in the classroom. That was the sort of drug that I was after. And even from that first lesson, I thought, yes, I absolutely love this. There are all of these young faces, and I am going to communicate something to them. I am going to teach them something. I'm going to get to know them. They are going to teach me things too, as well. And that magic of the classroom. I did feel it in the first lesson. And I thought, I've just got to learn how to stay alive, how to do all of the things I'm meant to be doing, or some of them. And it's going to be great. So I had that to cling on to right from the beginning.
I thought it was really interesting. There's like all decisions, there's a combination of logic and instinct in what you're trying to do. And you say, I want to be a teacher and I'm going to teach maths. And then you switch to econ and business studies, which has a little bit more continuity with your past role. How did you feel a defeat there, or was it just like, oh my God, this is the way to make this work? How did you feel about that change?
No, maybe I'm just horribly arrogant. No, did I feel it was a defeat? No, I thought, okay, that doesn't work. Let's try something else. And also that's been very much the way with Now Teach, that we keep doing things that don't work, and then we have to switch and change and find something that does work. And that is part of being in this new phase of life where change becomes easy and not frightening. So actually, I'm changing schools again in September. The old school that was sort of interesting was wildly strict, and I learned a lot from it. But after 4 years, I thought, actually, this isn't really working for me. It's not quite, doesn't allow me to be the sort of teacher. So I'm going to change. I'm going to do something else. So from September, I'm teaching in a school in Whitechapel, pretty much 100% Bangladeshi intake, all girls, and I'm teaching A-level, which I've never taught before. So I don't see that as having got it wrong previously exactly. I think, well, I'm just sort of I'm feeling my way. Eventually I'd like to find the school that I'm such a perfect fit in. Maybe I'll stay till I'm 75. But yeah, you're asking about maths. So I had a lot of these decisions, I take them very, very quickly. So they're often wrong. And the maths was absolutely like that. I thought, always loved maths at school. It's a beautiful subject. I've had it with words. Maths is so amazing. 100%, you can be 100% right. What fun, I'll teach maths. If I had thought about it more carefully, I might have thought that actually, although my basic maths conceptual understanding is decent, my carelessness is horrible. And that was a problem for me as a student. You can't be a careless maths teacher. That doesn't really work. So I then became very stressed at my own carelessness when I was trying to teach them not to be careless. My explanations weren't tight enough. I realized I was going fundamentally against the grain of my personality in this. So there was that. Secondly, I do love talking. I think I might have mentioned that. And the point of going into teaching at a later stage was meant to be that there was so much experience of the world that we can all share with our students. Well, my experience of the world is frankly irrelevant if I'm trying to teach them how to multiply in standard form. So for all sorts of reasons, teaching economics has been a much better fit.
And I hoped you'd say that about the transition. It just, it's not about a failure. It's just about moving on to the next boat that's going to take you where you need to go. But the other thing is you did this big change and you started Now Teach at the same time. I mean, that's almost the definition of double or quits, isn't it? I mean, I sort of, why do them both together?
Well, it was ridiculous looking back on it. It was ridiculous. The hubris involved. I don't know if I feel ashamed or if it's kind of funny or if I'm sort of proud. Maybe it's all of those things, to encourage other people to do this when I had no idea what it was going to be like myself was an astonishing thing to do. I think the timing was by happenstance. I mean, I was going to become a teacher myself. I knew I wanted to do that. I was appalled at how the normal recruitment for teaching was so aimed at 22-year-olds. I was thinking, this is insane. There's a massive shortage of teachers nationally. Why are we ignoring this demographic? What is going on here? It's not that you weren't, there are clearly no age limits on becoming a teacher, but no one was saying this is for you. So I just thought, I'd like to set up something called Teach Last. And I'd gone to a party and I'd met Katie Wargrave's mum, Caroline, who I'd once interviewed for the FT. I started banging on to her about how I wanted to be a teacher and really there should be this thing called Teach Last for all of those people like me. And she said, well, go and talk to my daughter. She has been a teacher through Teach First, and she's set up a couple of social enterprises, and she might be interested in this. And I was actually quite pissed and was just sort of banging on. And then the next day I got an email from Katie saying, this sounds interesting. So I went to see her, and we got more and more excited talking to each other. And we just kind of went, should we do this? Okay, let's. So you could hardly say that was well thought through, but we had the bit between our teeth, and it was really exciting as well as quite scary at times.
Well, the 100-year life, multi-stage life, I'm thrilled you have, because as you said earlier, we lack the social institutions to support this transition. So good for you. And it must have been an extraordinary commitment to your own individual efforts. I guess it's also going back to the sort of wanting to do maths. It's just logic. You've worked out a logic that this is needed. So therefore, let's do it right now.
I think you're too kind to me there, Andrew, actually. I think luck played as big a role as logic in this. And you're absolutely right. I had upped the ante on myself. So I'd made, this sort of national news story about me becoming a teacher and encouraging other people to do it. I had to like it. Not liking it was not an option for me. And I did think in those those days when I was just messing up everything, I thought, okay, it's 5 years. I need to do this for 5 years. 5 years isn't that long. But that was only on my darkest days. But yes, I had to enjoy it. And I had a duty to all of the other people to make it work and stick with it. But maybe I needed that kick to do it in the first place. So, but I mean, I think for you to say that I'd thought through the logic of it and therefore it was going to work is way too kind, because you can think through the logic till you're blue in the face and you still might not like it. And that's one of the lessons that we've learned through Now Teach, that, again, with my kind of confidence and arrogance at the beginning, I had thought, right, of course, I can tell who's going to be a good teacher in 5 minutes talking to somebody. I thought, why do these training providers go through all of these ridiculous assessment days when it's bleedingly obvious? And so in the first year, we took 45 people. And I remember making a list, and I thought, right, these 10 are going to be amazing. Lucky kids who are going to be taught by these people. They are fantastic. This 10 on the other end of the spectrum, I'm not sure they should be on the program at all. I'm really quite worried about them. So I made that list, and I was wrong in almost every instance. And that the two who dropped out first were in my top 10. And some of the ones who are in my bottom 10, as it were, have turned out to be absolutely brilliant teachers. So I think if they'd made those lists about themselves, they would have also been very wrong. I think you don't actually know if you are going to like it, if you're going to make it work, until you've actually started doing it. So I think there is an element of luck in there too.
And going back to the commitment part, I thought what was interesting, lots of people talk about a portfolio career as they get older, and you record a conversation with Lionel Barber where he says, well, what about a board position on a cultural institution or something? But, although I know you work 3 days a week in the teaching side, you did commit, and the Now Teach is really about not doing a portfolio career, but really committing full time to something.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do a few other, so I still write for the FT a bit, but most of the other stuff I do is promotional, directly or indirectly, and the book was included in that, is promotional stuff for Now Teach. So I've absolutely committed to it. Yeah, and Lionel was saying, oh yes, I understand you need to give something back. I could help you sort of get on the board of the Tate Gallery or something. And I just thought, no, that's not what I mean at all. I want to be sort of all in, and I don't think there is any reason whatsoever why people my age shouldn't be really all in whatever they're doing.
I'm aware of time, Lisa. I want to carry on for another 10 minutes if I can, if you've got
that.
Do. So here's a tricky one. So, of course, you say in the book that you were born with all the cards stacked in your favour, referring to income, education and generation. We talk about the growing need to do this transition. how easy to do this transition if you don't have all those advantages?
Well, first of all, I don't know, because I do have those advantages. And I think it's really important in telling my story that I'm sort of very upfront about that. Um, what I can say is some of the other Now Teach people have done this without any financial cushion. Some have sort of, taken out a second mortgage on their houses, other have borrowed money to do it, or have massively cut back their expenditure. And when the job works out as they hope it would have, then it is all worth it. But it obviously makes it much harder if you're taking a huge financial risk. But the experience of them shows that it's still possible and it can still work out really, really brilliantly.
Okay. So I want to move on now to sort of, I'll say you've been on the other side of this transition. I don't know if that's how you feel, whether you still feel you're going through it. And I want to pick up on the theme that just runs through the end of the book about this sort of trade-off between continuity and change. I'm thinking about people who've made themselves about going through a transition. You write that the change released you from the force of habit. I wonder if you found those habits coming back, or you replaced them with new ones, or how your structure is different. You said earlier you had a lot of autonomy, but how different are you yourself?
Yeah, I haven't succeeded in changing myself at all. And sometimes I wonder whether actually what all of this has been about has been trying to become my mother in some spooky and weird way, that I tried for the first, 5 decades of my life to be as unlike mum as possible. And now it's all catching up with me. So there is some feeling of the sort of patterns of family reasserting themselves. But superficially, the habits of a married existence, of going into the same office, of doing all of that I've swept away. So how I spend my time, and to some extent who I spend it with, have just changed beyond measure. But you can change all of that. And, I've gone from, as we've talked about, being a sort of, kind of la-di-da grand person to being Little Miss Nobody. I've maybe learned a bit of humility, although some people don't seem to agree with that along the way. But I have not succeeded in changing myself at all. And I know this because when I was writing the book, I thought this was something that I should address, whether if you move the furniture of your life, do you somehow change yourself? Do you actually reinvent yourself? So I sent out an email during lockdown to, I think, about 15 people who know me absolutely inside out and have done for decades, my closest friends and my family, asking them if they thought I'd changed. Had I got nicer? Because I now spend my time doing more worthwhile things. Had I got more humble? And I'm afraid the answers came back, no, 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 which was a bit sobering in a way. But yeah, maybe we're never going to change ourselves and it doesn't really matter. And what we need to do is just open ourselves to new experiences. And so that's why in the book, my book is called Re-Educated rather than Reinvented, because I do feel that I am being re-educated in a whole fascinating new world.
Yeah, there's a Nietzsche quote which I think comes from the Pindar poems, which is kind of the point of life is to become who you are, having realized what that is. And I always kind of think sometimes change is appealing because you want to become who you're not. But I don't. It sounds a little bit. That's
Yeah,
I've
I've never even heard that. That's a Nietzsche quote that's passed me by completely. I love that.
It's a good one, isn't it?
Yeah, that rings so many bells. So maybe I am sort of, if it doesn't, I've become more myself through this.
Now,
I think that's interesting.
the other thing is along with continuity and change. As you said, there's this. You close in this sort of the final chapters paint a picture of you sort of becoming your parent, becoming your mother, teaching, doing the garden, but at the same time, there's this sense of just mixing with many more younger people, not just students but teachers, and just being open to just a different perspective and all sorts of dimensions of diversity. So I wondered, is it about accepting being older, or is it about feeling younger? Which of those two tends to dominate in that final chapter for you?
I've got such strong feelings about this. I think that none of this is about feeling younger. I really reject the idea of feeling younger as if that was the aim. I think what the aim in all of this is, and what I come out of it feeling, is that being 62, as I now am, is a really interesting age to be. And if you are 62, how very lovely to have, as you say, all of these friends who are not 62. Just when you're 18, you don't want all your friends to be 18. It's, they do tend to be at that age. You're not likely to have friends who are 62. But now at 62, I have all of these young friends who are trainee teachers like me, and that we have a lot in common. Of course, we have ways in which we're very different, but that does make life so much richer. And although I'm not longing to be young myself, that's not the aim of the game at all. I like being with people who are young, in particular my students, because they do have their whole lives ahead of them. And that's such an optimistic thing.
We were talking about change and sort of whether you've changed or not. So I want to pick up on the sort of the different age theme. And how do you look back at your earlier self? Do you see a continuity, or do you look back in a different way, whether it be you at the FT or you 20, 30 years ago?
Yeah, maybe I haven't been doing a lot of reflecting and looking back at myself. I guess I've more been, or I haven't, I've been thinking a bit about my upbringing, and I think I've moved along quite a straight line, actually. I think because I sort of went to the school I was expected to the university, to the FT, all of that was a straight line. And now that line has moved off in a different direction. But I look at my younger self and I think I was on quite a treadmill all that time, trying to achieve various things and goals which were very important to me at the time, and now seem a bit less so. Of course, I wince and cringe at my younger self too.
It's probably a good thing to do. I think we should all do that.
Yeah, I mean, I was just a massive show off and I was insecure and all of that's a bit cringy. But, yeah.
When I was thinking in the introduction, I thought it would be wrong to say and former FT columnist, partly because you still write for the FT, but also if the whole point of your book is about a transition, then why introduce you in that way? I wondered how you felt about being known as the former FT columnist. Is it how you see yourself, or do you just see yourself now where you are and where you're going?
Oh, you see, that is such a great question. If people say, what do you do? I think it's only in the last 6 months or so that I've said, I'm a teacher, full stop. I think until then, I would have said, oh, well, I'm a teacher, but I'm a very new teacher. I've just started at this. I've been a journalist all my life. So I felt the need to give them the backstory. I'm not quite sure why. Maybe I felt a bit of a fraud saying I was a teacher because I actually didn't know how to do it. But now I like saying that. But in saying that, I do feel that I'm being slightly misleading because I'm not a teacher in the way that someone who's been doing it all their life is. I'm very different to that. But still, it gives me a lot of pleasure just to say I'm a teacher. As to how you introduce me, Andrew, I happy to be introduced in any way you see fit. So I'm very happy to be the ex-FT journalist who still sometimes moonlights. Yeah, fine.
I want to intergenerational stuff, and then when we want to now teach for a bit more. But what came through your book really strongly was how you looked up to your parents and got their advice or ignored it, but you were thinking of them. You also turned to your children for advice when you make lots of the big decisions. And then you're at a school where, of course, you're mixing across the generations. There's a lot written about the importance of that intergenerational connectivity. Does that drive you, or is it just people are people? I wonder how you feel. Are you conscious of the difference in generations?
Yes, I am, and I think that importance is, yeah, it is important. Of course, it's important because people see things differently at different points in their lives, and I would often ask my children what they think about things. I won't, as I used to ask my parents too. And actually, I'm aware of this at school, that although, I love being with my young teacher friends because they're such a laugh, I think they like having me around too, because they ask me a lot of questions and for help on all sorts of things, because they know that the advice I would give them will be a bit different to the advice that their friends are giving. So that diversity, the age diversity, is just massively, massively important. And I don't think people think enough of it.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And again, going back to Mark Friedman, biology flows downhill, I think is a fascinating idea. But let's move on to Now Teach, which you said you're running with Katie Walgrave. It seems, to have been hugely successful. So you sort of achieved this double success. I wondered, there's two ways to look at Now Teach. One is bringing skills and benefit of experience to younger people. The other is then just exposing those people to the ideas and enthusiasm of younger people. Has your idea of the relative importance of those two things changed since you've been doing Now Teach?
No, I think it's both, and I think you're absolutely. I mean, I think it was both from the beginning, and you can break that right down to the motivation of people going in. That it's partly for them to have great, for them, the teacher, to learn from their kids, to have really sort of, to enrich their lives. But it's also really important the other way around. And I don't weigh one higher than the other. I think they both really matter. As far as the motivation of the teachers go, for the good of the whole society, I think it's more important that kids have the best possible education than that sort of bored derivatives traders in their 50s find something fascinating to do for themselves. So for the good of society, I think it's more for the kids. But for us, the, as it were, bored derivative trader, both are equally important.
So you said earlier about how difficult it is to sort of know who's going to succeed. And I want to go back to the selection process. Not just about Now Teach. We know there's lots of ageism in society. We see it in lots of sort of employment surveys for older workers. And in the book, you sort of say you were frustrated initially at feeling people didn't understand the attributes of people in their 50s. But of course, at the same time, it may well be that people in the 50s don't quite understand what's needed and what other skills are needed. So I wondered where you were on that one in terms of rejecting older people just because they're older, or whether understanding what is needed to re-transition and change needs to be sharpened in older people. I wonder what you've learned from the selection process there.
Yeah, I learned in that case that we were both at fault. And, as I said, I was at fault because I didn't understand what was actually required now in schools and what the environment would be like and what skills were actually needed. And I think some of the selectors were at fault because they had no experience of recruiting people in their 50s. Absolutely none. And so to expect them to fit the same model wasn't quite right. So I think this is something that we've done quite a bit of work on and have got a lot better at, in trying to bring both sides closer together. And the weeding out that Now Teach does on candidates is really now very good. Much better idea of who is going to take to this new world and who isn't.
In the book, you say about 75-80% of people stick with it and get a job. What happens to the ones who don't?
Well, the ones who don't drop out, I guess. But what do? Well, a few have gone back to their old careers. So a few are now back in sort of banking or whatever. Far more have hung on to what they wanted, which was to do something more useful. And they're maybe tutoring kids, or they are involved as school governors, or some are involved helping us at Now Teach. They're sort of still engaged in the world. And one of the things that I think is so lovely, really, is I'm very proud of our Now Teach parties that we give. And quite a few of the people who have dropped out still come along to the parties, and so to that extent consider themselves to be part of a movement and close to the others, and really do keep in touch. So I view that as a success, even with those people who decided for whatever reason teaching in a classroom really wasn't for them.
And what next for Now Teach? Is it sort of Now Nurse, Now Code, or are we still sticking with Now Teach?
Well, gosh, I think we've got to make this work properly and make it work nationally and make it bigger. And we know, goodness knows I could hardly have been in the FT for so long without knowing that the single surest way of making your nascent concern die is by trying to do too much at once. No, but what we hoped is that by setting this up, we would encourage other people to set up, as it were, copycat organizations in other areas. And we are looking at doing something with foster, to trying to encourage people to become foster parents. So now Foster is up and running, and that's very exciting. But that's clearly connected, that's sort of, it's about children, so it's got a very natural connection to Now Teach. But what I would like to see is not just sort of Now Nurse for the caring professions, or sort of, Now Detective, Now Police, I would like to see schemes for people in their 50s to become journalists, or to become absolutely anything at all, to retrain, to start again, to bring a more diverse experience into those other fields. Age diversity, experience diversity, what's not to like.
And it's a major opportunity for educational institutions as well. I mean, there's so many people of that age in need of it, so there needs to be some sort of shift. And what about Lucy Kelloway? I mean, do you feel like you're reaching a still point, or do you think there may be another major change at some point in the future? Will a purple kitchen counter at some point lure you away, or what do you think?
Okay, so first of all, I am nowhere near as good a teacher of economics as I want to be. Nowhere near. I'm decent now. And in some things I'm good. I'm good at bringing the real world in. But I am nowhere near as good on those elasticity, trying to get kids who really struggle. How do you teach kids who really struggle to learn? How do you teach them economic concepts? So I'm not as good as that as I would like to be by a million miles. I've never taught economics A level. I've got a mountain to climb, starting, oh my God, in just, 9 days time. So that feels like change enough for now. I did say slightly aggressively to one of my early mentors, who clearly thought I was rubbish and the whole thing was a publicity stunt. She said, "How long are you planning to keep this up for?" And I said, sort of bitingly to her, "Till I'm 75. So a gauntlet was thrown down to some extent, but I don't think that I'm held to that. I'd love it if I was teaching when I'm 75, because it would show that I've really made a success of it. But I wanted to call this Teach Last, but I don't think it is necessarily last at all, because last goes on for many, many years. So who knows? Maybe I'm going to be career changing when I'm 85. I really hope so.
Yeah, well, I hope so as well, Lucy. And thank you for your time. Thank you for the book. I hope we did 3 things for people listening. The first was get people interested in going to read the book, Re-Educated by Lucy Kellaway. 2, to get in touch with Now Teach, nowteach.org.uk. But also for those people listening, thinking about transitions, just mulling over what Lucy said about, the background and the difficulty or the challenges or the opportunities. So all of that, of course, is covered in the book. So thank you enormously, Lucy.
Thank you, Andrew. It was such a pleasure talking to you.
This broadcast has been brought to you by the Longevity Forum as part of Longevity Week 2021. We are very grateful to our sponsors, Juvenescence and Burnbrae. For more podcasts, visit our website, thelongevityforum.com, or follow us on Twitter, longevity_forum.